May 2012, South Dakota. Hayden Hensrud's opponent passed away after taking a severe beating from him in the ring. 2 years later, South African MMA athlete Kieran Davies followed suit, killing his opponent in the ring this time around. I've compiled a list of UFC fighters who killed people. Let's begin with the fighter who killed Alfredo Castro Herrera. In 1981, Angel Luis Rodriguez entered a match with a fire only a few could match. His opponent, Alfredo Castro Herrera, stood across the ring, unaware that this fight would be his last. The fight started like any other: hard hits, fast moves, and no room for error. Eventually, Rodriguez got in a hit that sent Herrera to the ground. The crowd roared with excitement. They did not know what had truly happened in front of them. Rodriguez was declared the victor, but the win quickly turned bad. Herrera wasn't getting up. Hours later, Alfredo Castro Herrera was pronounced dead, the injuries from that knockout blow proving too much for him to survive. Rodriguez may have stepped into that ring expecting nothing more than a fight, a test of his own strength and skill, but when he left, he would, no doubt, be carrying the weight of knowing that his hands had unintentionally delivered a fatal blow. While some might argue he wasn't to blame, the brutal truth is that in that ring, on that night, it was Angel Luis Rodriguez who had landed that blow. What's even sadder is Alfredo was just 15 years old at the time of his death, and just like Angel Luis, Charlie Ward made sure his opponent Juan Carvalho had his last fight ever. The fighter who killed Juan Carvalho. In 2016, combat sports witnessed another tragedy, this time in Dublin. Professional fighter Juan Carvalho stepped into the octagon for a match against Charlie Ward, a match that would be remembered as a tragedy and a mistake. As the fight progressed, Ward's superior form and skill resulted in a TKO victory for him. The real story begins outside the ring. Carvalho needed medical attention. The impact of Ward's strikes had led to severe brain swelling, a critical injury that no amount of post-fight medical care could reverse. Just 48 hours after the match, Carvalho surrendered to his injuries and died. Moving on, our next killer in the ring is Dillian Kleckler. His victim was Justin Thornton, who was killed at 38. The fighter who killed Justin Thornton. On August 20th, 2021, Thornton, a 38-year-old American fighter with a history in MMA, faced Dillian Kleckler in a bare-knuckle fighting championship (BKFC) fight at the Mississippi Coast Coliseum in Biloxi. The match, which began with high expectations, ended in horrifying tragedy within just 19 seconds. That day, Thornton entered the ring with aggressive intentions. He was looking to make a mark in the bare-knuckle fight scene, and this was the fight in which he was going to do it. As soon as the fight started, he launched himself at Kleckler, ready to fight. However, Kleckler's defense was up that day. Kleckler landed a left hook that sent Thornton crashing headfirst to the canvas. The force of the punch was so extreme that Thornton was immediately knocked out, his body immediately going limp and unresponsive. The referee immediately stopped the fight, seeing that Thornton was unconscious. Emergency medical personnel rushed him to the hospital, where he was placed on a ventilator. However, despite their best efforts, Thornton's condition was already critical before arrival. After arrival, he was found to be partially paralyzed, and the severity of his injuries became pretty clear. It was hard to tell if he would ever get up again. Over the next several weeks, Thornton's health continued to deteriorate, leading to his death on October 4th, 2021. Thornton's death, unlike some others, got some press within and without the world of combat sports. BKFC President David Feldman issued a statement expressing his profound sorrow and extending condolences to Thornton's family. The organization pledged support to his loved ones during the tragic time, but that wasn't going to bring Justin back or change the fact that he died fighting against Dillian Kleckler. Next up, we head to South Dakota, where a young talent was about to have the fight of his life, literally. The fighter who killed Dustin Jensen. In May of 2012, Jensen, a promising amateur MMA fighter, entered an unregulated cage fight in South Dakota. What followed these words is a disturbing series of events. When Dustin Jensen stepped into the cage for what would be his final fight at Ring Wars 74 in Rapid City, South Dakota, he had no idea that would be his last day alive. His nemesis on this day was Hayden Hensrud, and Jensen fought with everything he had. The battle that followed was intense, but eventually, Hensrud got his opponent locked in a tight triangle choke, and Jensen, if he didn't want to die, had no choice but to tap out. After the fight, Jensen appeared fine, casually watching the next two matches as if nothing had happened. However, things took a grim turn when he headed to the locker room to stretch. Jensen suddenly moaned in pain, then collapsed, experiencing a seizure right there in the venue. EMTs were immediately called, and he was immediately rushed to Rapid City Regional Hospital. That was where he received bad news. His brain was swelling dangerously. Hensrud had banged him up pretty badly. Jensen was placed into a medically induced coma to relieve the pressure, but even surgery couldn't reverse the damage. Days after his fight, Jensen was declared brain dead at 10:23 a.m. His family made the decision to donate his organs, but the young fighter's life had been cut tragically short. Jensen's fight that night was his fifth in under a year. This is probably a contributing factor to his death. This was unadvisable, and this pace likely pushed his body to its limit. Without any athletic commission to regulate the MMA event, Jensen was offered no protective oversight, and he paid the ultimate price. His death made him the third known fighter in the US to die directly after an MMA competition. This tragically is not the last time a death like this would happen. Hensrud wouldn't be the last to kill his opponent in a show of force. In 2013, Sam Garcia knocked Pablo Elochukwu out for life. The fighter who killed Pablo Elochukwu. When Elochukwu stepped into the cage that fateful night, his confidence radiated. He was prepared for what he believed would be just another fight, ready to take on Sam Garcia in what seemed like a typical match. Known for his strength and endurance, Elochukwu had trained rigorously, and there was no doubt in his mind that he would emerge victorious. But as the match progressed, everyone began to notice something unsettling. Elochukwu, who was normally composed and strategic, seemed to be struggling. He looked uncoordinated, as if the fight was wearing him down more than usual. He kept fighting, driven by sheer willpower while his body was giving out. As the fight neared its end, Elochukwu's movements became more labored. The bell rang, and the fight was over, but Elochukwu didn't walk away like he usually did. Instead, he collapsed to the ground, unable to stand, his body finally betraying him after the battle. Medical personnel rushed into the cage immediately, but it was clear that this was more than just exhaustion. The situation turned critical within seconds, and Elochukwu was hurriedly transported to the hospital. Unfortunately, despite their best efforts, the young fighter was pronounced dead upon arrival. The official cause of death was later determined to be cardiac arrest, a tragic thing for someone who appeared to be in peak physical condition. In the fight with Sam Garcia, Elochukwu's body had been put through the ringer and it just gave out. Now to South Africa, where Davies' elbow is about to take a life. The fighter who killed Buto Gailane. Buto Gailane's tragic death was a shock to all in the MMA world. The 29-year-old died competing in the Extreme Fighting Championship Africa (EFC Africa) on February 27, 2014 in Johannesburg, South Africa. Gailane was facing off against another South African fighter, Kieran Davies. Before the fight, he was judged to be in good health, but he took a powerful elbow to the head during the third round, and that would change everything. The impact caused immediate damage, and the severity of the injury was clear from the moment it happened. Gailane collapsed in the octagon, and medical personnel rushed to his aid. He was quickly transported to the hospital, where doctors discovered bleeding and swelling in his brain. Despite their best efforts, the injuries were too severe, and just a few days later, Gailane tragically passed away. His death sent shockwaves through the MMA community, a stark reminder of the dangers fighters face each time they step into the cage. This was Gailane's third professional fight, and unfortunately, he was still searching for his first win. His record stood at 0-2, with both previous losses coming by TKO. Despite these setbacks, Gailane entered this fight full of hope and determination, eager to prove himself. As a fighter from Cape Town, he was known for his grit and perseverance, qualities that made his untimely death even more tragic. EFC Africa President Cairo Howarth expressed his deep sorrow over the loss, calling it a huge tragedy for the sport and for all who knew Gailane. This wasn't an isolated incident either. Just 6 months earlier, a Brazilian fighter lost his life after suffering organ failure due to a brutal weight cut, and Gailane is the third fighter to die directly from injuries suffered during a fight. Gailane just wanted to prove himself, but sadly didn't make it. Davies' opponent died in the ring, unlike Iraburo, whose opponent died outside the ring. The fighter who killed Michael Kirkham. Michael Kirkham, an up-and-coming MMA fighter, stepped into the cage in 2010 with high hopes. His opponent, Carlos Iraburo, was another fighter hungry for victory. Like any athlete in the sport, Kirkham knew the risks, but he had the fire and a mentality that says, "I can do this, I'm ready." Unfortunately, that night was not to be his. During the fight, Kirkham was knocked out by Iraburo. At first, it looked like just another tough loss, but what wasn't immediately visible was the severe injury that had happened beneath the surface. Kirkham had suffered a subarachnoid hemorrhage, a type of brain injury where bleeding happens between the brain and its protective layers. It's an injury that can be catastrophic, and in this case, it was. Despite the fast response from medical staff on site, the damage was too great. Within 2 days, Kirkham's second fight of the night, his fight for his life, came to an end. Another promising athlete with dreams of reaching the top was gone too soon. For Kirkham, this fight was meant to be a milestone in his career, a stepping stone to bigger opportunities. Fighters put everything on the line, training for months and pushing their bodies to the extreme extreme. They know the dangers, but rarely does anyone think the worst will happen, like in this case. One hit from Carlos sealed Kirkham's fate, and Carlos Iraburo's name became forever linked to this loss. Now to the case of Barrera's illegal hit. The fighter who killed Mike Mittelmeier. On April 21, 2012, Bolivia's Collision Red Fighting event took a sad turn when 20-year-old Mike Mittelmeier tragically lost his life due to an illegal strike during his MMA debut. Mittelmeier was a promising athlete with an impressive kickboxing background, and he was making his transition to professional MMA that night. His opponent, Franz Barrera Quinaya, was a seasoned Muay Thai fighter. This was a contributing factor to the anticipation of the match. The fight began with high expectations, and it went as many thought it would. A fair match, but an eventual win for Mittelmeier. Mittelmeier managed to take Barrera to the ground and attempted a leg lock. That's where things quickly went wrong. Barrera, perhaps in a moment of desperation, sent an illegal heel strike to Mittelmeier's head while he was down. As expected, the impact knocked Mittelmeier out cold, and the fight was stopped immediately. Despite being declared the winner by disqualification, the outcome was grim. There's a reason, after all, that the move was prohibited in the MMA. Just moments after the fight ended, Mittelmeier collapsed. It was later revealed that he had suffered a massive brain hemorrhage. The situation was made even worse by the event's inadequate medical provisions. There was reportedly no ambulance on site, leading to a critical delay in getting Mittelmeier to the hospital. Although emergency surgery was performed, Mittelmeier never regained consciousness and passed away shortly thereafter. Unfortunately, the delay was fatal. He never regained consciousness and passed away shortly after. Desperate to win, Barrera struck at Mittelmeier, and that was his doom. The end of it all for him. One cannot say which is worse, Barrera's death strike on Mittelmeier or Pereira's death win over Fernandes. The fighter who killed Mateus Fernandes. Mateus Fernandes, a 22-year-old amateur Brazilian bantamweight, died after a TKO loss during an MMA fight in Manaus, Brazil. The event was called Remulus Fight, and it took place on a Saturday night. Fernandes was competing in the first fight of what usually would be many. The fight went fairly well until his opponent, Obed Pereira, delivered a combination of punches in the third round that knocked Fernandes down. Fernandes was down, but Obed wasn't done. Even after he hit the canvas, Pereira landed another punch before the referee could step in to stop him. One punch was all it took. After the fight, he began experiencing seizures. He was rushed to a nearby hospital and began suffering multiple heart attacks. The doctors fought for 2 hours to save him, but Fernandes was pronounced dead at 11:45 p.m. local time. According to Wallace Alves, president of the Amazonas Athletic Commission, CAMA, Fernandes did not undergo heart or brain examinations before the fight, as only blood tests for HIV and hepatitis were required for pre-fight medical clearance. The promoter of the event, Romulo Lobo, expressed that the promotion was assisting Fernandes's family, but did not provide further comments. Fernandes trained at Formando Campeões, which is a social project that helps people struggling with drug addiction through martial arts. The project's coordinator, Vanderluz Cantuarias, later revealed that the coroner's report showed that Fernandes's death was due to an alleged drug overdose, not the injuries sustained during the fight. While Fernandes passed pre-fight drug tests, it was reported that he may have used drugs the night before, leading to complications during the fight. Whether Fernandes's death was due to his drug abuse, the fact still is, had Pereira taken it easy after knocking his opponent out, maybe Fernandes could have survived the night. But we'll never know, just like we won't know with Ricky Muse and his victim. The fighter who killed Donshay White. On July 16, 2017, at Hard Rock MMA 90, 37-year-old Donshay White stepped into the cage for what was meant to be a triumphant return after nearly 2 years away from the sport. The heavyweight matchup against Ricky Muse was set to be a test of White's skills, to sharpen him up after years away from the ring. And at the start, it did seem like White was ready to make a strong comeback. However, as the fight progressed into the second round, things took a turn for the worse. For White, Muse, showing no mercy, began landing a barrage of strikes that White couldn't effectively defend against. It was a brutal display of striking, and White found himself overwhelmed. At 2:22 of the second round, referee Gary Copeland made the crucial decision to stop the fight, sensing the severe damage White had sustained. Despite being visibly injured, White was able to walk out of the cage under his own power, which was what might have him given a sense of reassurance. But moments later, White collapsed backstage and became unresponsive. Medical staff performed CPR, and then White was rushed to Kentucky One Health Sense Mary and Elizabeth Hospital in an attempt to save his life, but despite all efforts, he did not survive. The exact cause of White's death was never officially confirmed, but the toll from the fight, especially after such a long layoff, was likely a significant factor. Also, the fight itself should not have happened. For context, Kaylen Ray, who had competed earlier that evening, also collapsed backstage. With no medical staff left at the venue, the Kentucky Boxing and Wrestling Commission had no choice but to cancel the remaining fights. Yet again, we have another death from a ruthless beating, this time from Ryan Dunn, the fighter who killed Rondell Clark. On August 12, 2017, 26-year-old Rondell Clark stepped into the cage at Cage Titans XXXV in Plymouth, Massachusetts for just his second amateur MMA fight. Formerly a Westboro High School football player, Clark had to abandon his football career due to injury. He found a new passion in MMA and was eager to prove himself in the octagon. Clark's first fight had been a quick victory, ending very quickly, which predictably pumped his confidence as he prepared to face Ryan Dunn in a 170-pound fight. He entered the cage, ready to showcase his skills and continue his winning streak. The first round was all Clark. He took control of the fight with impressive strikes and tactics. However, as the match progressed, his energy began to drop. By the third round, the tide had turned. Dunn seized the opportunity, landing strike after strike, relentlessly beating on Clark. The onslaught ended in a technical knockout that ended the fight, with Clark unable to get up. He was carried out of the cage on a stretcher before everyone in attendance. Clark was rushed to a Boston hospital, but despite medical efforts, he passed away just 3 days later on August 15th. Plymouth County prosecutors and state police launched an investigation, but as of August 16th, the exact cause of death was still undetermined. Cage Titans president Michael Polver stated that the cause of Clark's death was not attributed to any specific blow or submission during the fight. The tragedy left many questions unanswered and cast a shadow over the sport. Perhaps that is just an attempt at shielding his show. Whilst you ponder the answer to that, let's talk about Vince Lombardi, the fighter who killed Sam Vasquez. On October 20th, 2007, the Renegades Extreme Fighting event in Houston, Texas, ended in tragedy when 35-year-old featherweight fighter Sam Vasquez faced off against 21-year-old Vince Lombardi. This fight was a significant comeback for Vasquez, who hadn't stepped into the cage for over a year. With a modest 1-1 record, he wasn't pressured to win, but he also wanted to relaunch his career. The fight was the third on a packed 12-fight card, carefully supervised by the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. From the get-go, both fighters were giving it their all, trading punches and showcasing their skills. But it happened in the third round when Lombardi landed a devastating right hook to Vasquez's chin. Vasquez, visibly shaken, wobbled and then fell to the mat. The referee, recognizing the severity of the situation, immediately stopped the fight at 2:50 of the round. Emergency medical personnel quickly moved in to tend to Vasquez. Vasquez was rushed to St. Joseph Medical Center, but his condition continued to deteriorate. He suffered a seizure shortly after arrival, and over the next few weeks, he endured 2 surgeries to address a brain clot. Despite all the efforts, Vasquez's health took a tragic turn. On November 9th, he experienced a massive stroke and was placed in a medically induced coma in a desperate attempt to save him. Unfortunately, on December 1st, the fight that had started with so much promise 2 months prior ended in tragedy. Sam Vasquez passed away. Next, we head to Aberdeen, where an unnamed fighter was about to end Lee Yor's life. The fighter who killed Jamestown Lee Yor. In April 2015, the small town of Aberdeen, Washington, became the site of a tragedy during the Brawl at the Mall event. Lee Yor, a promising amateur fighter, had just finished his match and seemed fine on the surface. After his fight, no one suspected a thing. He even reassured event promoter Scott Bean that he was just tired. He managed to smile and showed no obvious signs that something was seriously wrong as he made his way back to the locker room. But what seemed like a typical post-fight fatigue quickly turned into something far more serious. A nurse, who was keeping an eye on the fighters, felt a sense of caution and decided to follow Lee Yor to the dressing room. It proved to be a crucial decision. Once inside, Lee Yor suddenly collapsed, unresponsive and without a pulse. The nurse immediately sprang into action, performing CPR in an attempt to revive him. Despite these urgent efforts, Lee Yor's condition deteriorated. He was rushed to the local emergency room and later transferred to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, where he was listed in critical condition. Sadly, his fight for survival ended when he passed away later that day due to kidney failure. It was later discovered that the kidney failure was linked to a pre-existing medical condition, something that had gone undetected in the mandatory pre-fight medical checks. Just like Lee Yor, Zainalov died in an amateur fight against an unnamed fighter from what shouldn't have been a serious matter. The fighter who killed Ramin Zainalov. When you're hit by punches you just can't take, this is what happens. Ramin Zainulov's story is one of the most heart-wrenching tales in amateur MMA history. In 2015, Zainulov entered the cage as he always does, ready. But what happened was that night would tragically become his final fight. The fight took a turn when he was knocked out by a takedown. The crowd cheered. This is what they'd come for. But for Ramin, this was the hit. The takedown, while appearing to be just a particularly forceful slam, had catastrophic results for Zainulov. The impact led to a severe brain hemorrhage for Zainulov. This wasn't just a bad night in the cage, it was a life and death situation, and they did try to fight for his life. Despite the immediate medical response and swift attention, Zainulov's condition proved too critical. He fought hard outside the cage, but succumbed to his injuries, passing away far too soon. What makes Zainulov's tragic end even more unsettling is the fact that it occurred during an amateur match. The intensity of the cage can be unforgiving, and sometimes it can be unforgiving to the extreme. What's even sadder is if the MMA made a list of fighters who died in the ring, Zainulov's amateur fight with his unnamed killer may be overlooked. One name that they definitely cannot ignore is the unnamed fighter who killed Douglas Dedge. The fighter who killed Douglas Dedge. In March 1998, Douglas Dedge, a mixed martial artist from Chipley, Florida, traveled to Kiev, Ukraine, for a fight that would tragically become his last. With no inkling of the devastating turn his journey would take, Dedge stepped into the ring, ready for what he anticipated would be an intense and competitive match. The fight was indeed fierce. Dedge engaged in a high-stakes contest where every strike mattered. The back-and-forth exchange of punches and kicks had the crowd on their feet, captivated by the raw display of skill and determination. However, the same aggressive exchanges that thrilled spectators ended up causing severe injuries to Dedge. Even with immediate medical attention and a rushed evacuation to the hospital, the damage was irreparable. His condition quickly deteriorated, and he passed away just 2 days after the fight. At the age of 31, Dedge's death was not only a profound personal loss, but also a grim milestone for the MMA community. Douglas Dedge became the first American fighter to die from injuries sustained in an MMA fight, marking a dark moment in the sport's history. His passing highlighted the extreme risks that fighters face, often unseen by fans, but ever present in the world of mixed martial arts. Dedge's story serves as a stark reminder of the perils inherent in the sport and the deep impact such tragedies have on the fighters, their families, and the MMA community as a whole. To close this round, another of the more popular UFC deaths in the ring, another death from a beating. The fighter who killed Tyrone Mims. When Tyrone Mims stepped into the cage in August in 2012, one doubts he was prepared for a brutal amateur MMA fight. It is more doubtful that Tyrone thought he would lose his life after this fight. His opponent that night would change his life forever. Mims was young, just 30 years old. Tyrone Mims was also filled with passion for the sport. He was fighting that night at the Fight Night at the .6 event in South Carolina. Everything seemed standard. Everything went fine. Or so everyone thought. Shortly after the fight, it became clear that Mims wasn't doing well. He became unresponsive, but he was still at the venue, and paramedics were able to rush him to the Medical University Hospital. From then on, time was ticking. The situation, however, could not be salvaged. Mims was pronounced dead at 9:27 p.m. Who could have guessed that this regular amateur fight would be his last? What makes this story even more unsettling is the fact that Mims was in relatively good shape going into the fight, with no obvious signs of distress during the match itself. If you enjoyed this video, check out one of these boxes playing on your screen for more captivating stories like this.